So I guess let's get started. First, a little bit about who I am. I'm a designer currently working at Relic Entertainment. Before that, like you said, I was at Rockstar. I've worked for a few other smaller companies around town here as well, everything from 3-person small indie studios up to AAA things. And the projects have been just about as varied. I've worked on everything from casual Wii shovelware up to AAA action games to sort of art house indie games. So a lot of those experiences were really good and some of them weren't so great. And this talk is sort of based on my reflections on those and the conclusions that I've come to. A bit of an overview about what I'll be talking about. I'm going to start talking about just holistic design very briefly, just try to describe what I mean by it. Then I'll go on to the big picture of our industry as a whole, as well as how we relate to the big picture on a project basis. Then I'll talk about how asking questions during production can improve everything from our budgets and our schedules to the overall quality of our game. And then I'll just wrap up quickly, and hopefully we should have about 10 minutes left over for questions that you guys might have. Also, as a bit of a brief preface before I get started, this isn't a classroom. I'm not going to be trying to instruct you on how to make games. I just want to try to provoke some questions about how we do make them so that we can maybe think about better ways to make them. In addition, I'm also going to be using some examples during this presentation. I want to make it clear that that's never meant to be a statement of the quality of that game. I just thought that there was some small part of it that could have been made better with a more holistic method, or that was doing something very well using a holistic method. So that said, what exactly do I mean by holistic design? I imagine that there's a lot of different thoughts on what that could mean. First off, it's nothing new agey or Zen related. I've had some people bring up that holistic has some sort of connection to that. It doesn't. Holistic approach is just any method or philosophy that uses an understanding of all of the different parts in order to determine the whole. So when I say holistic design, I mean using all of the different parts of game development in order to understand the whole better. That means making sure that you're constantly keeping track of the different relations between your audience and user experience, as well as the market that you're going to be released into, as well as the development team and the resources that you have, as well as the goals of the game, both artistically or more practical goals like business goals, whatever they are. You need to understand everything and their relationships together in order to understand how to target your production towards creating the proper experience for those things. So moving on, I think that in general, our industry has a few problems. We sometimes get caught up in details. We just don't quite understand how to just pay attention to the big picture. And I think that that's something that we need to work on fixing. I think that it brings up a lot of different issues during development. And I just want to quickly go over a few of specific instances of issues that it can bring up, as well as some examples of what those are and the problems that they can cause. So first off, I think that we often end up sort of forgetting to pay attention to what the big picture goals are, what the user experience is intended to be, and we end up drowning our audience out. We put in too many extraneous details that aren't really needed to actually achieve an experience, and then the audience can't actually see what the experience is. This can happen in all kinds of different ways. I think oftentimes, as developers, we kind of hone in on whatever we're doing, and we just do that, and we don't pay attention to how it's going to fit in. And when you get a full team of developers doing that, you can just get a big mess of ideas. A good example of this is if anybody's played an RTS game or a real-time strategy game with just too many systems to possibly keep track of, too much micromanagement. That's too many details in your gameplay for somebody to keep track of, and it ends up drowning it out and creating a more frustrating experience. A more visual example of this is the game Space Giraffe. There's some great ideas in Space Giraffe, and there's some parts of the gameplay that were really good, but the visuals were just so detailed that they end up blocking out a lot of the interesting elements and the good ideas in it. So it's important to make sure that whatever it is, whether they're narrative details or gameplay or visual, you need to make sure that they're all working together and not drowning your audience out. Another sort of similar problem is that you can end up distracting your audience. You can have like one specific detail in there that's out of context with everything, but it's so strongly featured that the user can't ignore it, and it actually distracts them from what the actual experience you're trying to deliver them is. So I think a good example of this that probably everybody's familiar with is Jar Jar Binks. Not a very loved character, and I don't think that's specifically because he was a terrible character. I think it's because he didn't actually fit in with that movie. They were trying to do some specific things for user experience, and when they put in that character, he didn't quite mesh with that, and he distracted the user because he was impossible to ignore. He was always up in your face. So because of that, he ended up just becoming a distraction from the actual experience. I think we do that in games a lot as well. A really good example from an otherwise absolutely fantastic game is the combat in Mirror's Edge. The game is about movement and speed and parkour and pathfinding and all of those things. And when they gave the user a gun and they have to pick it up and stop and aim, and suddenly you've just totally distracted the user from the actual experience you're trying to deliver. You've distracted them from the movement and the speed and forced them into something else. And I think that it ended up really detracting from that experience. And I think that in that kind of case, that can often happen when somebody on a team says something like, well, we're making a first-person game, and we've made a lot of shooters before, so there's going to be guns in it, right? But nobody sort of takes a step back and says, how are guns actually going to fit into that experience we want to deliver to our users? And when nobody does that, you end up with something like that that can distract the audience from what that experience is. I think another common problem that we end up running into when we forget about this sort of big picture thing is that we can end up underwhelming our audience. We don't pay attention to the amount of resources we have, or we don't pay attention to the amount of details that we're putting in. And the result is that we can end up putting in different parts of the game, different features that are just too shallow to really grab somebody's attention, or else they're just not quite polished enough to fit in with the rest of the game. And I think probably this happens a lot of the time when people are, again, forgetting to pay attention to that big picture, that user experience they want to achieve, and they're trying to put in specific little details that are sort of bullet points for the back of the box. You want to put in that feature just so you can say you have it. So you never actually get that feature up to the depth required to grab somebody's attention. And the result is that you end up watering down the experience. A good example of this in a game recently that had some amazing ideas behind it is Spore. Spore was a really interesting game. It had tons of cool ideas to it, but it had so much stuff that there's no way they could have possibly made each of those different elements of that game detailed or deep enough to actually interest somebody for a long period of time. So some of those things, like for instance, if anybody's played this and they've played the sort of little adventure mode thing where you run around with your little critter, it just isn't sort of deep enough to actually compare to anything else on the market. And because of that, the entire experience gets watered down by it. Even if there's some great stuff in there, you can't possibly get that and the RTS element and the creature creator and the procedural animation system and the civilization builder and all of those things up to the level of depth required to sort of grab a user's attention. Another thing that I think we end up commonly doing is we sort of break the spells we put our users under. So anytime you're creating an interactive experience, you're sort of creating a fantasy for your users to get immersed in. It doesn't matter if it's a sports game and you're just creating the fantasy of being an NFL player, or it's a shooter and you're making your players feel like a soldier, whatever it is, there's some sort of fantasy that you're immersing your users in. And when you forget about that fantasy for a period of time and you work on something that doesn't fit in with it, you can break the context of that fantasy, and you can either chip away at your user's suspension of disbelief, their willingness to believe in that fantasy, or else you can outright shatter it. And the result is that somebody gets pulled right back out of it, and that's when they're going to stop playing your game. That's when they're going to turn off the console or the iPhone and go somewhere else. So you never want to do that. And I think it's something that as game developers we run into quite often when we're sort of focused on exactly what we're doing and we forget to pay attention to how it's going to fit into everything. And then we just put it in the game anyways. And I think that we're actually quite forgiving with ourselves in general of it, because we often, as we're creating those different features, we're willing to sort of say, oh, well, it's better for gameplay if I do it this way. It doesn't really matter about the story or the context of it. But that's not actually true, because it's all a very holistic project. Remember that your user's experiencing that fantasy based on everything in it. So when you put in something that breaks that fantasy, even if it's maybe not quite as interesting for the specific encounter design, it can actually still break your user's suspension of disbelief and pull them out of it. In a non-game related example, I think a good example of that, and again going back to the new Star Wars, is the midichlorians. For anybody who doesn't know, those are in the new movie where they test the Force on Anakin and they say, oh, you have this many midichlorians, so your Force strength is amazingly strong. And the reason that that was something that broke a lot of people's suspension of disbelief is that the original movies had a very specific reason for having the Force. It was sort of a tool that they utilized in order to talk about Luke's hero's journey. It was something that a sort of spiritual energy he had to find within himself, and sort of a mystical force that he had to utilize throughout the films. In the new movies, they explained it away by saying it's a bunch of microorganisms living in your bloodstream. So anybody who's familiar with the old movies suddenly has their view of the Force shattered. Their suspension of disbelief is broken, and I think the result was that a lot of people were very frustrated with that specific detail. And I think that we run into that issue in games quite commonly. Finally, I think one of the most prevalent issues in the industry right now is that we oftentimes end up overreaching the bounds of our project. We forget about the big picture, we forget about what resources we have, we forget about what we can accomplish, we end up wandering and exploring too much in our work and not actually having a targeted approach. And the result is that we have to sacrifice one of three things. We either sacrifice our budgets, our schedules, or the quality of our game. And I think that that's a terrible thing to have to do. And I think we can solve that by paying more attention to the holistic picture. But when we don't, we just sort of get lost in the details, and we end up spending way more money or way more time, or we just don't finish it project because of it. And I think just how big of an issue is sort of testified to by the massive amount of delays in almost any AAA game that's come out recently, the huge amount of layoffs that happen in our industry, the studio closures, the amount of overtime that almost everybody in this industry has to work. I think a lot of that is just because we don't have targeted enough approaches in our productions. Just as a quick example, and something that I'm sure most people already are familiar with, Duke Nukem Forever. It's been in development for like 15 years. I think there's a reason for that. I don't think that they ever knew what their big picture was, what the intended experience was, so they're never actually able to achieve their goals, so they could never release the project. So I think we need to start being a bit more careful of that. So all that said, I think that there's a lot of sort of stuff that we need to improve in this industry, and I think we sort of have a mission to improve it. We have a mission to start developing our games with the big picture in mind so that we can deliver better quality user experiences that have a deeper impact on our users and our audiences. And we have that mission to try to sort of start improving the productions of our projects, improve the budgets, improve the schedule, so that we can actually concentrate on the important things more and not so much about just barely reaching that deadline. Luckily, I already think there's some great examples of games and studios doing this out there. There's a few quick examples of very well-targeted games. I think Mirror's Edge, even though I mentioned it as a negative point, was otherwise extremely well-targeted. It was a fantastic game, and you can see that just looking at the game, because things like the art style were geared towards those core experiences that I was talking about. They knew that they were making a game about movement, speed, pathfinding, parkour, so they made a game with a very clean art style that had strong use of specific primary colors that would attract the user in specific directions. They also made sure that the narrative supported the ideas behind the game, so that when people were playing it, it was all supported properly and felt like a cohesive project. Another good example of probably one of the best targeted games in recent memory is Portal. It was based entirely pretty much on just one game mechanic. And I think the result of that is that the game has endeared itself to the users who have played it. I mean, most people who have played Portal really do love it, and I think that there's a good reason for that. Everything in that game is based towards that. When you look at the art style, again, it's very clean. It's very clear about what the user can or can't do. The result is that they enjoy the puzzles more. The narrative is very interesting, but it's just there to support that. They didn't try to do 300 other features. They just did what was important. They don't have advanced AI systems trying to support the Portal thing because it wasn't important. They didn't need that in that game. Finally, I think one of the best targeted games of the recent generation is Gears of War. Gears of War was built to be a cover-based action game, and that was about all they really tried to do with it. They didn't try to do everything else as well. When you play Gears of War, you don't have like 100 different enemy types and 30 different weapon types and all of these different things that are just adding up into this big old pile of stuff. Instead, they just have a few of each of those, and they made sure that they were targeted and worked well with the specific goals they had for that project. You can also see this in specific game design decisions in that. Things like the health system recharging supports the cover system by having the player actually go and take cover when their health needs to recharge. So they're actually supporting that with other systems within the game. That's very clever to do, and I think it ended up sort of helping make the project far better than it could have been if they hadn't. They also did something very clever with the multiplayer, which is that they didn't try to do too much. Current multiplayer experiences are like out of hand. When you look at the games that are coming out, you see things like 32 versus 32 person multiplayer and 60 different game types and all of these crazy online features, more than you can possibly imagine. And all that's fun. Gears of War didn't try to do that. Instead, they did, I think, 2 game types on release, both of which were very well polished towards the experience they were delivering. And they did 4 versus 4 multiplayer, and that was it. And it was so well done, and it fit so well with the rest of the game that it became extremely popular. And I think that that sort of testifies to just how important it was that they had that targeted approach. So given all of that and that mission, I think that there's some specific tools that we can use to get there. And I think one of those is asking the right questions during development. I think that by asking specific questions throughout all phases of development, we can end up sort of improving our productions so we can have better quality games, and we can also improve the budgets and the schedules of the project. That starts in pre-production, where we need to discover the whys of the game. This is something that should carry all the way over to the game, so you need to start by asking, why you're actually making that game. And although that probably seems obvious, I think that this is something that's very seldomly actually asked and answered, and even more seldomly communicated. You need to understand what your goals are in that game project before you actually start developing it. Otherwise, you're just going to wander around and get nothing really accomplished. Those goals can be anything really too. They can be practical goals related to business development or studio development, or they can be more artistic goals related to things like giving a specific user experience or exploring a specific idea during the production. So there's some good examples of those out there as well. I think that, let me see what my examples actually are. Whatever. Mass Effect, right, yeah. So Mass Effect had a very specific business goal that they were trying to deliver. They were trying to create a franchise, and they knew that when they started developing the game. And because of that, I think they were able to sort of gear the production towards that the whole time. The first game was built in a way that the tech supported the future games. The story hooked directly into them to make sure that people were interested in seeing what was going to happen in the future. And specific design decisions were made that would support this idea. Things like having your character transfer from one game to another is very important to the user experience because that's supporting them going on to the next game, and it makes it more interesting. It gives them more of an attachment to that franchise. But they had to plan for all of that at the start. You can't have your user's character transfer to the next game unless you know that you're going to be actually trying to accomplish that. So it was very important that they understood that they were making a franchise before they started. And a more artistic example of a goal, the game Flower was created to try to elicit positive emotions in its users. And everything in that game is geared towards that. It's amazingly well designed, and I think that if anybody here hasn't played it, it's probably one of the best examples of game design based on an idea you can find. In that game, the art style, the sound effects, the music, the gameplay, the controls, all of those are geared towards creating a positive experience. They avoided specific game design sort of archetypes, things like failure or death systems, because that didn't create that positive experience they were trying to get. And I think that there's a lot we can learn from that kind of thing, because when we're creating games, we often just fall into these same archetypes, and we don't pay attention to how they're actually feeding into the goals of the project and the user experience we're trying to achieve. Another example is BioShock. In BioShock, they had some specific ideas they wanted to explore through the production. They wanted to explore the ideas of the novelist Ayn Rand and her philosophies dealing with objectivism and altruism, and so that they created an entire world to explore these ideas. When you look at that game, the art style, the environments, the level design, the narrative, specific game design features are all built up to support that. And as sort of an interesting side point for this, for anybody that's played BioShock, one of the main characters, Andrew Ryan, who built the world Rapture, the reason that he was supposed to fail was because, unlike Ayn Rand's heroes in her novels, he was not a perfect character. He forgot to question himself while he was building Rapture, and the result was that it failed. And I think there's something important that, as game developers, we can probably learn from that, and that we need to start asking ourselves more questions throughout development. So, after you have all of those goals, you need to start understanding how they're going to be important. You need to boil those goals down into something that's actually attainable. Essentially, you need to get a mission statement. And a mission statement should be something that supports all of those goals you have, but supports them in a way that describes the user experience you're going to be delivering. Because essentially, no matter what you're doing when you're creating a game, and no matter what your goals are, they're going to be carried through by giving a specific experience to a user. So when you're creating a mission statement, you need to sort of describe the user experience you're going to want to deliver, and you need to make sure that that user experience is targeted towards all of those goals that you've figured out. Following that, you can break that down further and build up some pillars of design, some central construct ideas around which every other decision you make in the game is going to be based. So these can be all kinds of different things related to supporting that mission statement as well as those goals. In a very cliche example, you might be making a game where you want the user to feel like a badass super soldier. If you're doing that, you might have a pillar of design related to having visceral melee combat. In that case, you know that when you're dealing with combat, you're going to be trying to sort of work towards this one pillar. And you know that that pillar is supporting your mission statement. Make sure that when you're developing your goal or your actual game, you're able to do it in a targeted sense. Once you understand what your mission statement and your pillars of design are, you can move into actually figuring out how they're important in production. So at this point, you can actually start designing a game. You can build up a set of features. You can start describing a production plan. And you can try to figure out how you're going to carry through all of those goals and to actually achieve that user experience that you're describing in your mission statement. And it's important during this phase to make sure that you're keeping a very holistic view of the project. You don't want to just start designing stuff and forget about your development team and what your strengths and weaknesses are and what resources you have or how much time you have or what market you're going into. All of those things should have an effect on everything that you're doing. So make sure that when you're starting to actually develop your game in pre-production, you're keeping track of how everything is related to one another and what sort of limitations you're going to have to work around and that kind of thing. Or a slightly different question that I think we often forget to ask ourselves as game developers that seems incredibly obvious, but I think we need to start asking ourselves more is why are we actually making a game? Games have some pretty specific strengths and some pretty specific weaknesses. They're very different than other mediums, and we need to start actually paying attention to how we're going to harness those strengths and sort of avoid the mediums or the weaknesses. So I think that a good example of this in a sort of reverse sense is the game. I'm sure that everybody or the game Mario, I'm sure everybody agrees that it's pretty awesome, and that's because it was made to be a game. It was designed fully to be a game experience. The movie, on the other hand, was not really made to be a movie experience. It was a direct translation of the game. And in fact, I think, if I can find it here, Miyamoto himself said that the one thing that I still have some regrets about is that the movie may have tried to get a little too close to what the Mario Brothers video games were, rather than trying to create a unique entertainment experience. And I think the point there is that when we're developing games, we need to make sure that we're not just trying to translate some other experience. And I'm not just talking about making games that are based on movies. I'm talking about no matter what we're doing, especially because we're a young industry. I don't think that we often have quite as much to draw on for inspiration from within our own medium. The result is that we try to draw inspiration from other games that might not actually directly translate well to games. So we need to make sure that we're understanding what the strengths and weaknesses are in order to actually give the best experience possible. Following all this, you can move into production, where you can use asking questions to ensure that you have a targeted approach and you can trim off the fat of the project to make sure that you're only getting the best possible experience. I think that all starts with asking, why are your features important to the big picture? How are they actually adding to the user experience you're trying to achieve? And if they aren't, then why are you putting them in? Further, I think you need to be assessing constantly, are they worth the resources they're costing? Because no matter what you did in pre-production, what you designed, you can never predict exactly how something's going to come through. So you need to understand how you can, so you need to look at how they're actually developing and whether they're actually adding to the user experience in the way you want, and whether they're worth the resources that you want or that you're spending on them. It's a pretty simple addition-like statement. Is it adding enough to the user experience to be worth the resources that it has? If not, you need to be willing to cut it. You need to be willing to either get rid of it completely or else reprioritize it to the back so that you can get what is adding the most to the experience for the best cost in the game first. Next, I think that we need everybody on the teams to be asking themselves, why are you doing what you're doing? By that I mean that it doesn't matter what sort of role you're playing on that team. If you're a designer, an artist, a QA guy, a programmer, a producer, whatever you're doing, you need to understand what the holistic goals of the project are, and then you need to understand how what specific task you're doing is fitting into that. And there's a couple of reasons for that. First, if you're not paying attention to that, you can end up wasting a lot of work. So when you're working on these things, and this happens all the time, you get concentrating on just this one little feature that you're designing. And the result is that you can end up taking it in some direction that isn't actually targeted towards that specific goal that you're trying to reach. So this results in people having to redo that work, rework it, explore a whole bunch to get to that goal. The other thing that it can do when we're asking ourselves this question is it can actually improve the quality of their games. It can make sure that everything that actually gets in the game fits into that game. So the point is that, I like that picture. The point is that when we're working on these things, we can't, if you're just concentrating on what you're doing, you can't be sure that it's actually going to fit properly into the game with the rest of the styles and the user experience you want to deliver. So you need to make sure that it does. And another very important part of that is actually making sure that you're communicating. Because no matter what you did in pre-production, no matter what awesome goals and mission statement and pillars of design you have, if they're not communicated effectively to the team throughout the project, people can't ask the previous two questions. If people can't ask those questions, you're going to end up with a mess of a development where you're wandering all over, taking longer, spending more, and getting lower quality for it all. So I think it's really important to make sure that you understand how you're communicating everything in your game and that you're communicating it to everybody that's on the team that needs to know it so that they can ask those two questions previously. Finally, in post-production, I think that it's important that you actually follow up on the whys of your game. Why did your game matter? This means things like post-mortems. understanding why your game failed, why it succeeded, how you can follow through on these things is very important. You can use that to plan for the future. You can use your understandings of what you did right and what you did wrong to actually improve future projects. And that can result in everything from Valve looking at Portal and saying Portal 2 is a good idea, to all kinds of different things, to just in unrelated projects or in your careers, understanding how you can do better in the future. The other thing that it can do is allow you to actually improve your present. And I think there's a really good example of this that came up recently in the industry, and that's Double Fine Games. They created Brutal Legend, and although I love that game, it wasn't quite as well received as they'd have liked. And after that, when they were developing Brutal Legend 2, it was canceled. And I think at that point they had a choice to make. Most studios in that case would look for the next AAA project to do. Other studios would be forced to lay people off. Instead, what they did was they took a different path. They reassessed what their goals were, and they understood that there was other ways to achieve them. So that they decided that instead of making the next AAA game, they were going to make a series of smaller games where they could develop them quicker with the same team and hopefully be a little bit more creative in them even. And I think that's a very positive approach to take in our development. We need to understand how we can improve the present based on what's happening in the past and what our goals are. Possibly the most famous example of this recently is Nintendo. When the Nintendo DS came out, they weren't sure how it was going to do. I think that's actually the reason that they didn't call it a Game Boy system, is because they were afraid that when it would come out, it would actually not be well received and it would sort of tarnish the reputation. Instead, it came out and it did amazingly. The result was that they looked at that, realized why it did so good, and used those lessons to develop the Wii, the resulting platform which exploded and did amazingly throughout the industry. So I think that there's a good lesson to be learned from that. So to quickly wrap up here, I think that it's important to understand that everybody on the team can help. It doesn't matter whether you're a studio lead or a lead designer. You can start helping right now by just asking questions about the big picture and understanding how your work fits into it. By doing these things, you can actually help have some very serious positive effects on your production. You can start developing work faster to better quality. You can communicate it to the rest of your team if you're asking these questions and understand it. And you can help develop that big picture better, even if you're not in those lead positions, by just making sure that it's clear defined to you. In the end, it's all about understanding how your work actually fits into the game so you can improve the quality and have less wasted work. Finally, to just quickly wrap up, I think that games have an enormous amount of cultural potential. I think that we can have a very important place in our society, but I don't think that we're quite there yet. And I think that we need to work to achieve that. And I think one of the most important tools for getting there is holistic design methods and asking questions during development. Hopefully I've convinced you guys of that a bit too. That's about it.